Well, welcome here to beautiful Niagara-on-the-Lake at the FCPC 2019 CEO Conference. We just had the wonderful experience and pleasure of having a presentation from Giselle Kovary, President and co-founder of NGen People Performance. It is really extraordinary, these generational differences that we're having to contend with all the way through. How do we get managers like myself, who is a baby boomer, conditioned to deal with, in many cases, 4 different generations within their organization who, based on your presentation today, are very, very different?
I think one of the best ways is to help just raise awareness initially, because there are absolutely those 4 different generations. In fact, there's 5 generations when we include the traditionalists. And as I mentioned in the presentation, while the traditionalists are in most cases not in our workplace because they're older and they've retired, they are still in our workplace in many different ways, in their mindset, in the ways in which our organizational culture is structured, in the ways in which perhaps we are engaging with traditionalist-minded industries or sectors. And so we've got those 5 different perspectives, and helping managers first raise awareness that they exist, and second of all then saying, how do you tap into what are the strengths of each generation? So you can absolutely have, and you absolutely do have people that may have a traditionalist mindset and they're 23 or 24 or 25 years old because they've come from a traditionalist culture, traditionalist background, traditionalist upbringing. And at the same time, they may be working with a millennial or a Gen Z and they're not getting along. So when the leader has an awareness that this exists, then they can self-identify and say, okay, I'm recognizing where some of those challenges are. Then we want to say, okay, based on the fact that we have a multi-generational team, what can we do to maximize the skill sets of the different generations we have in our team and manage any of the clash points? Because you're right, they're very, very different. And those clash points come into place as it relates to change and the perspectives around change. The clash points can be around work style. When we don't understand someone's work style, we often make an assumption about their work ethic. So we say people aren't working hard enough, or we've heard a lot of negative things used to describe especially the younger generations. And then the third is, when we have these differences or we have these friction points, it's about being able to have a leader that can raise the dialogue and say, okay, I'm seeing this at a more macro level with the whole team, or I'm seeing this across a department, or I'm seeing it across a business, and I'm recognizing there's something here that we haven't tapped into yet. There's some way that we're not engaging one of the generations or 2 of the generations. Because what happens is, in the race to engage employees, what I've seen is organizations swing the pendulum too far. They've engaged all their younger colleagues and in fact forgotten about their Gen Xers or their baby boomers. And that doesn't work either. So we need to look at opportunities to engage everyone.
Well, there's so many things that you have to do. I think one of the things you talked about in your presentation today was the open door policy of your CEO, but you have to have a special card to get onto the CEO's floor. One of the challenges too, I find, is there's a trust issue, because older generational leaders have grown up in a completely different environment. And in many cases, there wasn't that dynamic of many multi-generationals as they were growing up in their business career. And now they've got this. But then there's that trust factor. Are they actually working when they're at home? Are they actually doing the things they say because they want to come in late, leave late type thing? How do you get through that trust thing?
A big part of it with the managers and the leaders that I work with, and this could be frontline leaders, and this goes all the way up to the executive team and sometimes the board level, is just having a mind shift to say, we want to focus on performance, absolutely. We want to focus on collaboration. We want to focus on productivity, and we want to focus on, delighting our customers. When we take that perspective and put it through that lens, is this behavior meeting those needs? So absolutely, a lot of managers say, if I can't see you, you're not working. Well, how do we know someone's working when they're in the office? And leaders say, well, it's because I'm there, I see them. There's a lot of people, frankly, who go into the office and don't necessarily get a lot of work done. So we have to challenge ourselves as leaders to say, are we really focusing on the right thing? If we're going to focus on time in, time out, which it used to be, you had to be in by 9 and leave by 5, or be in at 9 and stay till 9, whatever it is. But now we've shifted our businesses to say we're going to focus on results. We're going to focus on output. We're going to focus on productivity. And when we do that, do we really care where people are when they're doing the job? And actually, the research shows in many cases, people that work virtually, or people are working remotely, or people who have an opportunity for flexibility, in fact, outperform those that don't. They have the autonomy to choose where and when they want to work, And in fact, we have to coach people usually to turn off from their work, not to have to turn it on more.
Many organizations are trying to pivot here to try to address the generational transitions. You also talked about the fact sometimes we go too far. What's the consequences of that?
Disengage Gen Xers and baby boomers. So when we go too far, we then all of a sudden we don't have the greatest amount of engagement across the organization. And we have people who've invested heavily in our businesses for years and years, sometimes decades, saying, I can't believe everyone's just rushing to make sure that the new intern or the new grad is happy. And I've been the one who's been putting in blood, sweat, and tears into this business, and you don't care about me. And in fact, in some industries, in some sectors, in some regions in the world, we've had to adjust our leadership styles such that younger people are coming in, they're making more money than people made when they started out. They're being given greater perks, they're being offered longer vacation times. And so the disengagement of those, those really core, long-term, committed employees. And so that's the risk. We do not want to disengage anyone. We want to find the opportunities to have a holistic approach so that we can engage as many people as possible. We're not going to engage everyone. We're not going to get 100% of the time. But more people more often can drive the needle around performance and productivity for a business.
We've been talking about millennials for the last few years, and they seem in many people's minds to be a very different generation. What the heck happened with Gen Z? It is just extraordinary, the dynamic between those two generations, how it has shifted so dramatically.
Well, as I alluded to in my presentation, in our research, so I conducted Canada's first national survey on Gen Zs, and we did a national survey because we wanted to gain insights around what's happening with this generation. They're between 7 and 23 years old. So my research looked at those that were 14 and up to 23. And almost 60% of them are being raised by Gen Xers. And so initially when we looked at the data, we were very surprised as well. And we said, why are these things happening? Why are these changes happening? They're bringing back very traditional values. They're demonstrating great respect for authority. They're not necessarily going to rock the boat the same way that millennials did. I think we can infer from the data a big component of that is the fact that the Gen Xers are raising them. And when we look at early parenting data or some research on it, they had questions around how does a baby boomer raise their millennial children predominantly, and how does a Gen Xer raise their Gen Z children? And Xers were asked, what do you want your kids to sort of take away, focus on? And they said, deliver on your promises, be true to your word, execute on what you say you're going to do. And they asked baby boomer parents, and they said things like live your best life, follow your dreams, be true to yourself. Yeah. So when we look at that, I think that can be one indication. I'm certainly not an expert in parenting and parenting styles, but I think that's one indication. I think the second is the economic conditions. So Gen Zs were much younger when the last recession hit. Their parents were much more significantly impacted. The baby boomers had a lot longer time to generate wealth and gather income to be able to bounce back faster. The Gen Xers didn't. And I think they passed that on to their children around responsibility and discussion around fiscal responsibility. 63% of them define themselves as savers versus spenders. That is a massive shift. And they want to save 85%, so they think it's important to save for the future. And they're being cautious about going forward in the future, even around student debt.
So what happens a few years from now as the millennials become the leaders in organizations and the workforce are Gen Z people down below? How's that dynamic going to work?
Well, it's going to be fascinating, and I was speaking to someone here at the conference who said that 60% of their leaders already are millennials. They're still leading millennials, though. So you're right, as those Gen Zs come in and millennial leaders, I think we're going to have to watch it. The millennials tend to have a very hyper-collaborative approach to leadership, meaning they really engage their teams heavily in discussion and dialogue. That can be a great thing. One of the downsides of that is sometimes they're not necessarily comfortable with making some tough calls, providing constructive, feedback. We don't use the word constructive anymore, performance feedback, or assigning work to people that they may not be as comfortable with. I think what we're going to see with that dynamic, predictively, is that the Gen Zs are probably a little more deferential to their leader. And they're going to say, okay, you're my leader, you're my manager, because we saw in our research that they are respectful of authority. They believe they need to do what their leader tells them to do. But where I do think there'll be great synergies is that they are both highly innovative and creative generations. They are both incredibly tech savvy. And I think the millennials are going to inspire the Gen Zs to really maximize their skill sets around technology, innovation, and creativity. And they're going to probably push them at an earlier point in their career to take a bigger leap in some problem solving or innovative ideas to a solution. I still believe that the millennials will be and act as the disruptive technologies in our business because they're just hardwired that way. And they've done a lot of great things in our businesses because they've pushed us out of our comfort zone. I think that Gen Z might sort of walk around the edge a little bit, but if their leader invites them in, I think they'll be all in.
Well, your audience today was sort of the leadership group of the Canadian food and consumer goods manufacturing. Aside from what we need to do in our organizations, what do we need to do about our brands moving forward to appeal, especially to a Generation Z, which this whole loyalty thing sort of gets brand marketers pretty excited?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that, and I'm certainly not an expert in marketing, there are people that do this for their careers. But I think that when we look at the brands and the research comes out around what are the brands that Gen Zs and millennials are attracted to, overall, they tend to be very tech heavy. So when we look at CPG and we say, okay, what are the things they're buying or what are the brands that they're associated with? They're brands that have had a long history of proving themselves. So when we look at some of the brands that are being most attractive to younger generations overall, tends to be technology. When we look at CPG, in some cases it's been brands that have been around for a long time, like Hershey's. And then we see things like Vans. People are saying, this is a brand. Cosmetics is really high, but it might be a new onset of a new cosmetic. And so I think that any way that a product can align to the values that the Gen Zs are saying are important to them. And what they're saying is, I want to have individuality. I want to make sure that you're a great corporate citizen because they vote with their dollars and their feet. They're not going to support a brand they don't believe is a good corporate citizen. And I think any way that a product is fresh and new and innovative. In some cases, that might be innovative because there's a new substance put in. We just heard about that this morning, whether or not cannabis is going to be added in, or whether or not there's going to be a technological component to the product. So there'll be products on our shelves, but there's an element to engage with that product via the technology. I think that's the way that legacy brands can be elevated into an environment where younger generations are excited about using the same brands their parents used and their grandparents used.
I have to assume with both the millennials and the Gen Zs that this whole aspect of corporate responsibility is absolutely critical.
Yes.
And as we start to look at what's happening around the world in regards to sustainability, I would expect these are going to be factors in regards to these generations' loyalty to your products if you are in fact dealing and thinking and interacting with your products in that way.
Absolutely, and I think that we saw that come out of the baby boomers, where they really were much more politically active than the Gen Xers were. So we have Gen Xers, and I'm a Gen Xer myself. As a generation, we were fairly apathetic. And then millennials really took that off. And they said, you know what, we're going to make sure that we hold brands accountable for the way in which they are engaging in our environment, the way in which they're servicing the communities in which they live, the way in which they're treating their customers. And there's lots of course, famous stories of where brands made a misstep and the Gen Zs called them to task on that. I think your Gen Zs are going to continue that, but what's interesting is that they're looking, I think, at brands and at products and companies, if they're going to work there, to say, are you something I can get behind overall? So it's not just whether or not I like your product and I'm going to buy it. Do I think your labor practices are good practices? Do I think that you treat your employees well? If there's a story about, cutting people's wages or abandoning their retirement fund or not funding paternal leave or maternal leave or not policies that aren't open to diversity and inclusion, that's where they will make a decision based on purchasing for a product based on the way in which an organization in fact treats its employees. And I think that is the new focus. It's not just you have to be good to the environment and to your customers, you have to be good to everybody that you behave, because if I don't like your business practices, I'm not going to support your product either.
Well, thank you for today. You did an amazing job. I think you really did bring some thought leadership to our CEO conference. And I think you really raised the importance that we really do have to think about this, because the consequences are certainly there, both from an employee perspective and losing the good ones, and also from a product perspective and losing great customers. Mm-hmm. So, Giselle, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a sincere pleasure.
Thank you. It's been my honor. Thank you.
Thank you.